Good morning, I'm Bud Beechwood, and this is Impact, where we focus on people, community affairs, and our environment. Archaeology is our theme in this half hour. A few years ago, a sandal in a cave at Fort Rock in south central Oregon indicated a culture that existed there about 10,000 years ago. The rock shelters and the house pits in Hell's Canyon give evidence of a prehistoric culture there dating back 8,000 years. In 1982, the Soil Conservation Service began excavating for a dam out of North Powder in northeast Oregon, and this was to be used for irrigation purposes. Some exciting artifacts were uncovered. Oregon State University was contracted to do the dig, and the results were really exciting. Part of this dig was sponsored by the National Geographic Society. I talked with Dr. David Brauner about the significance of this archaeological site at North Powder.
Well, the significance of this site is in the fact that we're dealing with a group of people that occupied this area between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. The cultural material that we're finding here is similar to what's called wind dust phase material, known to us from earlier excavations in the Snake River Canyon to the north of us. These people were apparently the pioneering people in the interior Northwest. We assume they came from the north, eventually from the Siberia area. But as far as we can tell, they were the first occupants of this country. Up till now, most of what we know about these people comes to us from several sites in the Snake River Canyon. And that's an area that was probably occupied during the winter months. So we really haven't had an opportunity up till now to find out what these people were doing in late spring, summer, and early fall, the kind of resources they were exploiting, where they were, and so forth. And this site gives us our first insights into an upland hunting camp that relates to these wind dust people.
Did they have fire?
Yes, we've found 4 hearths in this particular site, and they came into this country with total use and control of fire.
How were they up the scale as far as culture? Did they make jewelry or anything that would, say, resemble?
Well, they were basically hunting and gathering people. When we look at the tools and the material items that these people had, we're pretty much limited to their stone technology, since the wood and bone and fiber material that they could have used for clothing and for other products has disappeared through time. It's just weathered away. But in the stone technology we have here, we find that even these earliest peoples have some concern for ornamentation. We're finding, in fact, we have a pendant workshop here, if you will, where they're utilizing local soapstone to make pendants and a local schist to make pendants. And so we have these little ornamental devices in all stage of manufacture here at this site.
Were they nomadic in a sense?
They were probably nomadic within a confined area. They probably had maybe a several hundred square mile area that they exploited, that they used. And they probably kept themselves within that territory, returning to base camps like this one we're excavating on a seasonal basis.
They would more or less move with the food supply and, of course, probably the weather conditions.
Yeah, historically, yeah, you move with the weather conditions, getting out of the higher elevations in the winters. But we also find that historically, the peoples in this area pretty much moved with the availability of plant foods, when the plant foods were ripe and ready, and the women would do most of the gathering of the plant foods, and the men would travel out of the base camps to hunt game that was pretty much plentiful year-round. It's hard to extrapolate back. It's hard to extrapolate back 7 to 10,000 years to assume what they were doing historically they would have done that long ago. But it's very likely that they would have been gathering the many plant foods that were available in this area, and probably came here based or when those plant foods were available, and they could take large game animals at the same time.
There were cultures here both before and after Mount Mazama.
Yes, we have in this site, we have a well-developed lens of Mount Mazama ash in the site, And the major occupation of this small terrace was prior to the eruption of Mount Mazama. So it was heavily exploited prior to 7,000 years ago, this site. And with the eruption of Mount Mazama, we get a lot of ash draining or essentially flushing off the hillsides here, maybe on a seasonal basis, which made this little terrace a little less desirable to live on. And we have a shift in settlement away from the site that we're excavating here, essentially to the ridge behind me, where they were getting away from this colluvial material coming down slowly.
In a moment, we're going to look at some of the hunting tools that they used, but first I'd like to ask you, how has this reshaped our thinking about the people that lived here?
Well, the first thing that this site has done is given us, or is giving us, an insight into what these people were doing in the uplands. But possibly more important than that, it's beginning to refine our understanding of how long some of these toolkits, these cultures were around. In the Snake River Canyon, we get a very dynamic situation with people adapting to the river system, adapting to fish runs that they probably weren't adapted to prior to 10, 11,000 years ago. And these were hunting people that came out of the uplands into the river canyon around 11,000 years ago. And between 11,000 and 7,000 years ago, they began to learn to use the resources of that river canyon, and particularly the salmon. And as they became more sophisticated at utilizing the riverine resources, their toolkits changed and their way of life changed. And what we're finding at this site, where we're quite a ways away from the river, is that the people who lived here had really no reason to change. They weren't moving into the river canyon. They were an upland hunting people. And while we see change happening in the river canyons, we get a bunch of people that are rather conservative here. And so we get a toolkit lasting about 1,000 years longer here, a way of life lasting 1,000 years longer than it did in the canyons. So it's almost comparing a cosmopolitan situation in the canyons with, if you will, an upland, more of a backwoods situation where the people found a way of life that worked and they stuck with it. This site was abandoned approximately 3,000 years ago, and the last people to occupy this site utilized a projectile point that we refer to as corner-notched with a concave base. These style of points come into the southern plateau right around 4,000 years ago and persist up until 3,000, 2,500 years ago. And these points we find directly on the surface, almost in the roots of the grass, representing that final occupational period. As we move down in the sediments a little ways and we get into a mixed volcanic ash, sand, silt, and basaltic rock matrix, we start finding these lanceolate projectile points. They're made out of basalt, they're willow leaf in shape. We refer to them as cascade projectile points. They're a hallmark artifact or tool of a culture that was around 4,000 to roughly 8,000 years ago. At this site, these particular styles of weapon tips, these were probably used on a lance or a dart used with an atlatl, a spear thrower. These type of points ceased or don't occur before the eruption of Mount Mazama. These large points, these long ones, are associated with the smaller willow leaf points. We're not sure if these are knives or projectile points. We haven't found points similar to this in the Snake River Canyon area, so this is something that's relatively new at this site. But this is also found, these tools and the lanceolate points are found in the mixed ash deposits after the eruption of Mount Mazama. Before Mount Mazama erupted, and when this site was being used probably seasonally, we find people making weapon tips that were made of basalt and cryptocrystalline silicas and obsidian, but several styles of points. We find these small ones with indented bases, little stems put on them. We find, here's a lanceolate point with a indented base and a concavity in the actual base. We find a number of cryptocrystalline silica points, such as this, that has some basal reworking on it. indicative of this pre-Mazama technology. And the more spectacular points out here are made of obsidian, the largest points, once again with very definite hafting elements and concave bases. But this whole lower row of points are typical of what we would find with this wind dust culture that normally predates 8,000 years ago, but here it persists right up to the eruption of Mount Mazama. And we see a people with a toolkit that worked, and they kept it. When Mount Mazama erupted and there was about a foot of ash blanketed the landscape around here, apparently there was enough of a stress put on the culture and on the resources that they changed weapon systems. And we see that rapid change in weapon systems exhibited in the projectile points. That's the only thing out of a whole weapon system that will survive time. But we see a major change, a rapid change. And this may be a sign of some stress put on this culture as the result of the eruption of Mount Mazama.
In addition to projectile points, stone flakes were worked into pendants at this location.
This, one of the interesting aspects of this site is that we do have a source of soapstone nearby, as well as some very soft schist-like material. And the people who were living at this particular encampment were gathering the raw soapstone, and here's a piece of it that came out of the site that has been unmodified. Essentially just a few hundred feet from here, they could have collected this. They brought it to the site, and they began to work it down by taking some large flakes off of the soapstone nodules, and they began to, with a very coarse stone, began to smooth it down. On these pieces you can possibly see the striations, the lines left by this coarse type stone, used eventually to create a polish on the, to shape and to polish these small pieces of soapstone. And as they worked the stone down, they gave it a rough shape to the pendant, the final pendant form. Now, probably the most delicate operation in making a pendant is putting the hole through it, drilling the hole with a stone drill. And they would roughly shape the pendant, and before they did any more modification, which was time-consuming, to the ornament, they would put the hole through. And what we find at this site are a number of these pendants that had been crudely shaped with the remnant of the hole drilled in it. And while they were putting that hole through, they broke the piece. And without investing any more time or trouble, they simply discarded these specimens for us to find several thousand years later. We don't find, at least so far, we haven't found a completely finished pendant at the site. Those would have been taken away when they left the site, carried away with them. So what we find here is the garbage, the detritus, the failures, if you will, in the manufacturing process. But we have the whole manufacturing sequence here, making these pendants, which is kind of a first in Northwest archaeology for this time period.
The artifacts uncovered here have captured the imagination and interest of a cross-section of students and professionals alike. Money to finance the dig came from federal funds and a foundation grant.
This particular project is associated with a construction project essentially overseen by the Soil Conservation Service. And the Soil Conservation Service is providing the bulk of the grant money that we need to recover this archaeological site, to excavate it. But we're also very fortunate to have a major source of funding coming from the National Geographic Society as well. The National Geographic Society felt that this particular project was worthy of funding in that it represents, or the site represents a pioneering population in the Northwest, and the information that will be obtained from this project is new and unique to the Northwest, and may start changing archaeologists as well as the more interested public's attitude or understanding of local prehistory. We find that at this particular site that tool technologies are persisting longer than we'd anticipated. And so there are many questions about how cultures change and why they change that we haven't been able to answer or have been left open prior to the excavation of this site in the Northwest. And this site may start refining our understanding of who these early people were.